Step into the darkness of your mind. Are you ready to face your greatest fears? Welcome to AI Horror Stories. So let's listen to this story. It had been raining for 14 days when the great oak tree perched over the rocks finally gave way and the earth caved in. A local farmer was the first to spot the new crevasse opened ere the dirt washed from the jagged black stones. Didn't think much of it at first. Not terribly odd for it to rain for days on end up here in northern Scotland, is it? He later said. It happened up near the tors there where not many go poking about. Folks around here mostly mind their own business. But then me dog started barking something fierce, and I felt the ground give a wee tremble under me boots, and I decided it'd be best to go see what it was. It was his wife, a hearty, no-nonsense kind of woman, who first spotted the bones peeking through the fallen tree's torn roots. I imagine the soil got too wet for the old thing and a good breeze finally gave it the final shove, she told her neighbor. And up with it came much of the ground below, pulling open that strange cavern. I spotted the bones right off, mind you. Michael's never had an eye as keen as mine. I sent him right into town after that to get the police. The inspector who came to the scene studied the bones and discovered the broken, inscribed tablets peeking through the sodden clay. Whoever it was, he reported. They'd been dead for a long time. He relayed the incident to his superior, who phoned his superior, and eventually a call went round to the bigger city of Inverness, where the authorities thought it best, considering the age of the bones, to leave the scene be and hand the whole mess over to the academics. That was how, after 5 more days of continuous rain, graduate student Sonia Marston found herself standing on the edge of the rocks, peering into the dark below. She was a slight woman with pale hair carelessly gathered at the nape of her neck, dressed for the weather but heedless of the water misting her face and bare hands. She stood and squinted and huffed as she tried to make out any details through the gloom, but the shadows stayed thick and unobliging. "Mind yourself there, Sonia," said Dr. Wrangle as he wiped rain from his phone screen. He held his umbrella up by the crook of his arm, and it had begun to slip, water droplets pattering onto the old professor's padded jacket. "Watch the ground. The edges have reportedly been crumbling further inward with every day of this continued deluge." "The stone here is sturdy enough," Sonia replied, but she did take a step back. Cold air leaked from the crevasse where the hard rocks that had been split over the decades by persistent tree roots formed a kind of maw, hiding whatever lurked underneath. Her torch could only illuminate the upper crest and roughly a meter of striated earth, but the hollow echo and steady stream of water vanishing below proved the crevasse was much, much deeper than it appeared. The 3 other graduate students selected for this impromptu expedition were currently more interested in the bones and tablets that had been the reason for their trip from Cambridge than they were in the gaping pit. Sahar crouched by the sodden mound of dirt at the tree's base with the camera in hand, craning her back to snap photos while Callum held an umbrella over her and sniffed about the weather. Kirsty took the initiative to cover the tablets and struggled to get the pop-up canopy free of its storage bag. "Whoever put this in here last did a bloody awful job, Dr. Wrangle." "Most definitely, Kirsty." "In Devour on," he replied without looking up from his phone. Kirsty scowled, not that Wrangle noticed. "Not a lick of signal in this part of the country." "Sonia, have you any reception?" Sonia tucked her hand into the pocket of her jeans to find her phone, but given she owned an outdated model, she didn't have much hope. As a scholarship student, she couldn't really afford a better update. A solid X crossed through her empty service bars. "No, Professor." "Damn it all." The man shoved his own phone back into his canvas bag and kicked at the mud, readjusting his grip on the teetering umbrella. "I can already tell our survey will demand a much larger plot of excavation than our current permits allocate. We will need to get the department director's permission before expanding the scope of our flags." Said flags barely stuck their red tops out from the land's thick greenery, spaced every few meters around the crevasse and the emerging root ball. There might be a massive system of caves just under our feet, undiscovered after all these years. "I warned them we'd need a bigger team." "I did, I tell you." And I'll be proven right, ha. Callum and Sahar shared knowing looks. Dr. Rangel's short rant dwindled into more scholarly exclamations of thought as his 4 students began the preliminary stages of their survey. Sonia was excited. At only 23, and with a preference for theoretical anthropology, she had never been selected for any of the university's joint expeditions or field exercises before. With the poor weather threatening to degrade or ruin any revealed findings, it had been a matter of urgency to pick the first ready and able students and supervisor to go on this sudden trip. They had no assurances of finding anything genuinely noteworthy, but Sonia liked the mystery of it all. She didn't even mind the rain. Kirsty finally had the canopy set up and was inspecting the first of the tablets. These will need to be dated, of course, but the language looks to be Scandinavian in origin, she called over the plop of water on the stretched covering. The Glaswegian woman dug a stiff brush out of her kit and used it to slop away some of the muck. If these are from any of the Viking invasions against the Picts, they could be over 1,000 years old. Well, our friend here isn't nearly that old, Sahar replied, flicking through the camera's shots. If it weren't for how tightly interwoven with the main root system it is, I'd say the skeleton is barely a decade old. She shook her head, clearly puzzled. The skull and mandible aren't here. Sonia walked away from the main pit along the crevasse, instead moving toward the long fissures splitting the earth. She shone her torch over the boulders, bushes, and sodden dirt, searching for the missing skull or more of the mysterious tablets. Nothing caught her attention. Anyone have a guess at how long the tree's been here? Callum asked. Reports from the locals say it's been here well over 100 years, longer than anyone's memory. Dr. Rangel reached the small enclosure Kirsty had wrangled together and knelt by the first of the curious slate sheaves, bringing out a magnifying glass to observe the deep carvings. Lang can eat his heart out, he muttered in reference to one of the other professors at the university. The rivalry between the two had been subject to the student rumor mill for years. Our poor dead chap there might not be a Pict or a Viking, but these certainly ring authentic. The afternoon progressed, and the rain did not abate, looming bursts of thunder sounding over the distant firth as Sonia took over use of the digital camera and Sahar started extracting the bones. Callum kept up a light-hearted stream of conversation as each piece found a place on a folding table in the enclosure, and Sonia dutifully snapped photos from every angle and held up the ruler for scale. It should have been grisly work, but Sonia thought it morbidly fascinating though, she admitted being happy no meat remained on their dead fellow. She wouldn't have found it quite as enthralling then. Bending at the waist, Sonia tucked her long, wet hair behind her ears and brought her eyes closer to the skeleton's tibia. A quick squirt of distilled water from a bottle cleaned off more of the grit, and she saw strange but familiar lesions in the bone. That's odd. Dr. Rangel? A curious cluster of runes here. Thurisaz was often used to symbolize a warning, but with this here, a baffling hybridization of the elder Futhark. Dr. Rangel? Oh. Yes, what is it, Sonia? She gestured him over to her table. There's odd marks here on the leg bones. The professor took out his magnifying glass again and nibbled on the edges of his mustache as he peered through it. See these healed calcifications? It looks similar to something I've seen on photos of an ancient Grecian man attacked by dogs. Quite right, quite right. Sahar came to set another bone on the table part of the hand, Sonia guessed and swept her wet fringe out of her eyes before squinting at the tibia. Big dog, she commented. Look at the spacing of the teeth impressions there. I would guess it was wolves. Dr. Rangel frowned at Sahar. Wolves, he said. Why, there haven't been wolves in the British Isles for centuries. They might not have been from around here. The marks had healed over, after all. Grumbling ensued from both the professor and Sahar, while Kirsty and Callum glanced over the Norse slates. There's no plant fibers from clothing left, no labels, not a bit of meat to be found, Callum pointed out to the group. So the bones are older than they look, definitely. What with them being found with these Norse slates, is it possible we're looking at a Viking? Sahar snorted. Bones don't lie, Callum, and these just aren't that old. Bickering about advanced preservation or the possibility of it being a hoax broke out, and when Kirsty suggested the dead fellow might have stolen the slates and died out here by accident or by someone else's design, Wrangle looked entirely upset and not quite as eager to phone the university. If this expedition didn't prove worthwhile and he raised expectations too soon, his credibility would take a hit. Sonia sighed, all too used to the impromptu debates that plagued the departments, and she took the camera with her to take more shots of the site. The rain softened for the moment, and she enjoyed the reprieve as she walked past the perimeter and climbed over the rocks, snapping images of the area. The canopy with its red top stood out among the grey tors and deep green vegetation, as did the butter yellow of their rented all-terrain vehicle. She turned her face into the sea breeze and let it tug at her windbreaker, wincing when tiny pinpricks of water peppered her eyes. Fog gathered at the mouth of the firth and crawled in their direction, making progress over the shore as it inched into the Highlands. Sonia, born and raised in London, thought it a beautiful, if austere, landscape. From the enclosure, she heard Callum laugh, and someone had the good sense to start the generator and power their portable lights. The position of the hill and lower woods made it seem as if they were entirely alone in the world, perched above the shallow, swirling clouds creeping inland and over the village in the lower valley. The downed oak tree made for an odd inclusion in the otherwise picturesque scene, what with its roots and snapped branches splayed wild in the air, the leaves still green and flushed with life. Sonia walked along its side and balanced herself with one hand on the trunk. The rough bark scratched her palm. A hawk landed on one of the branches not far from Sonia's head. Startled, she looked up at the bird and the bird looked back, its body held with haunting stillness and its talons curled tight upon the branch, leaving furrows in the wood. Its feathers had a sheen of gold to them, caught and gilded in the scant bits of sunlight phasing through the clouds, and the beak looked sharp enough to bite fingers clean off. Studying it, Sonia lifted the camera and held the viewfinder to her eye, then clicked the button. The hawk shrieked and flared its wings. Sonia gasped and jerked back, her boots sliding in the mud. She hit the ground, and the camera bounced on her chest, though she managed to grab it before it struck the ground. She clutched it to her breastbone, feeling her heart race. That was close. Sonia. Sahar called. Can you bring the camera back? I'll be right there, Sonia replied, breathless. The cold seeped into the denim of her jeans, and she grimaced as she got to her feet and felt the muck cling to her legs. Gross. Sonia. Coming. She looked up toward the branch. The hawk had disappeared. The evening grew much colder than anyone had expected. The team's original plan had been to retreat to the village below once done for the day, but the fog Sonia had admired earlier in the afternoon had swelled and eddied, wrapping itself about the hills in such a way that it masked the road and the tricky cliffs framing the ascent. Fortunately, they prepared for the eventuality of not being able to find lodgings and so had a series of little tents to set up in the shadow of the fallen oak, provisions stored in the vehicle's boot. The night came upon them fast, but the curious students turned on the lights and kept working. Given the weather, they couldn't start a fire and instead opted for eating their dinner of dehydrated granola bars under the dripping canopy. They soaked up what heat the industrial lights emitted and chatted about home. Dr. Wrangle went to sit in the car and make phone calls again, or at least attempt to, leaving the younger people alone. Sonia thought it was probably macabre of them all to snack while sitting next to a table of disarticulated bones, but no one else said a thing about it. I much prefer the digs in Africa to this, Callum complained as he munched on granola and gestured around them. The heat is intense and there's bloody spiders the size of my fist, but at least it doesn't rain for days on end. Sahar snorted. You all should be used to it, shouldn't you? Being English and all. Those are fighting words, Kirsty replied with an exaggerated pout. I'm not one of these Sassenachs. Now hold on, we're not sure where Sonia's from. Callum raised an expectant brow. Mud smudged his cheek, and he hadn't cleaned it off despite being told about it several times. Well, Traitor or not a traitor? Sonia shrugged. Born and raised in London, I'm afraid. I like the rain. Kirsty and Sahar booed and flicked broken bits of peanut at Callum when he protested. Have you all done projects together before? Sonia asked, Sahar and Callum nodding, though Kirsty shook her head. We haven't done a project together before, but I've been around these two enough. She flashed a cheeky grin. And you? How's it over in anthropology? Sonia hummed in thought. Interesting enough, I suppose. Though we don't often venture out of the lab or archives. I've never been on an expedition before and fell into this one on accident, really, being the assistant on hand for Dr. Wrangle when the assignment reached him. Sorry your first dig is such a bore. Come on, Callum. I'm not joking. I think it's silly they called us here for this. Those tablets must be fake, I bet all the quid in my pocket on it. You haven't any quid in your pocket, cheapskate. You told us so at the airport. Did I? I might have exaggerated a bit. Sahar, who had paid for his coffee and crisps that morning when he begged off, smacked him in the shoulder. Callum laughed and leaned back, but in doing so, bumped the table of bones. Oops, shite. A piece rolled and tumbled, falling into the grass and disappearing down the incline. Good job, ya numpty. It was an accident. Help me look dash dot. The four of them got to their feet and slouched back into the rain. The clouds had intensified to such a degree not a single star shone, and given the lack of city lights, the whole of the mountainside was doused in unrelieved darkness. Their enclosure seemed like a bright, blinding beacon, and even armed with torches as they were, the light barely pierced through the shadows. They illuminated the grass in muddled, static-filled patches, and even Sonia, who liked gloomy weather and was determined to have an enjoyable experience this trip, felt exasperated. Where in the hell did it go? It couldn't have rolled far. It's a bone, not a ball. Even so, the group floundered about for nearly 10 minutes, slipping on the muck and through puddles, until Sonia's torch caught a glint of white under a low-growing elder bush. I think I found dash dot. Her words cut off in a sharp breath, and she almost dropped her torch. Sahar joined her. Looks like you found the missing skull, she commented, bending to extract it from the weeds. The mandible was still attached, and when Sahar held it in her hand, exposing it to the light, both women stared. They didn't hear Callum and Kirsty join them, but they did hear his startled yelp. What kind of sick prank is that? Because it had to be a prank. What other reason would there be for the skull to have literal fangs? Do you think the locals are having us on? Kirsty asked as she tapped a finger against the long cuspid tooth. Och, it feels reals. Have a look at that. Sonia gently eased open the mandible and probed her fingers along the jaw while Sahar held onto the whole skull. It did feel real cool and solid, with a natural yellow shade tinting the top. This is ridiculous. It's not real, Callum asserted. It looks like something from a Halloween shop. Real or not, Sahar took the skull back to the enclosure, where it looked all the more weird and ghastly in the harsh electric light. The cuspid seemed near an inch in length and naturally set against the lower mandible, the teeth formed around its intrusion. Sonia shivered. We need Dr. Wrangle, Sahar decided, and because Sonia thought that a good idea, she went with her while Callum and Kirsty stayed under the canopy. They tromped through the downpour, ignoring their soaked clothes and the mess it made of their hair as they went to the silent vehicle. Sahar rapped her knuckles on the driver's window. Dr. Wrangle? They pressed their noses to the glass and cupped their hands around their faces, squinting against the dark. No one was inside. He's not there, Sahar said. And he left the keys on the seat. Damn him. Sure enough, when Sonia tried the door, it wouldn't come open. Do you think he needed the loo? She asked, unable to ignore the nervous rise in her voice. He couldn't have gone far in this, could he? Not if he doesn't want to break his neck on the rocks, Sahar grumbled, her torchlight roving back toward the enclosure, over the glistening stones, disappearing toward the wooded tor. Where in the world is he? They searched the immediate area around the car and, finding nothing, met again by the driver's door. "I'll look over here." Sahar vaguely threw her torchlight toward the crevasse and the oak tree. "While you check the woods there. Try not to get lost, all right? No promises." Sonia caught Sahar's aggrieved eye roll before she turned away, and Sonia followed her original hunch toward the trees. Her breath came out in white puffs as the temperature cooled, and she longed for a nice dry robe and a fire, maybe a hot drink with something extra added in for a nightcap. "Dr. Wrangle," she called, stumbling over a fallen branch. "Ouch. Blasted Dr. Wrangle. Professor. Are you there?" Her voice echoed back at her like the chattering of crows, all clipped syllables and swallowed vowels. Frustrated, Sonia sucked in air and shouted, "Are you there, Dr. Wrangle?" Again, no voice returned aside from her own. Sonia was beginning to worry he might be injured. The professor had the build of a sedentary scholar with a penchant for biscuits and sugary tea. She could easily imagine him taking a wrong step somewhere and getting stuck, but where? Where would he be going in this downpour? From the corner of her eye, she thought she spotted movement, a shadow rippling oddly against the others, and she pointed her torch at it. The rain provided a continuous static, but the generator hummed beyond it, Sonia deaf to its roar until it suddenly went quiet, and the lights at her back sputtered out. The shadow disappeared. Sonia pivoted on her heels in the pitch blackness and cursed at a branch thwacking her arm. "Callum. Kirsty," she called. "Is the generator out of petrol?" No answer came, and Sonia was convinced everyone on the mountain must be suffering from spontaneous hearing loss. She couldn't see a thing even with the torch, and she was seized with the sudden urge to chuck the worthless thing into the undergrowth, but she kept it in hand and sighed. Sonia marched back toward the enclosure and tripped once, landing hard on one knee and hissing at the resulting sting. Water sloshed over the top of her boots, and she huffed, hands too filthy to peel her wet hair from her face, the rain forming new puddles in the bunched collar of her windbreaker. "I wished for a bit of adventure and got far more than I bargained for," she thought to herself, staggering upright. / could have been in my flat right now. Or in the library. As bad as the dust is for my allergies, at least I don't leave there with rain in my knickers. Sonia tripped again, falling on her wounded knee. She exclaimed, "I cannot see a ruddy thing. Can someone please get the lights?" There was no answer. When Sonia again managed to gain her feet, she moved deliberately, walking with care until she reached the edge of the enclosure and finally stepped out of the deluge. Her torch's beam bounced around the space and found no sign of Callum or Kirsty, only broken granola bars and rumpled wrappers. She called their names as she searched, and red gleamed in the slanted light, stealing Sonia's breath. A runny streak of crimson was smeared across the trampled grass. More of it dripped from the table now empty of bones. The table now bearing one bloody, smeared handprint. Sonia's heart thrummed in her chest, and with barely a thought, she ran for the crevasse, shouting for Sahar. In hindsight, it might not have been the best choice to go sprinting toward an open chasm in full darkness, but Sonia didn't think of that at the moment. Instead, she called for Sahar again as loud as she could, her voice high and thready with fear and a weight slammed into her side. Sonia couldn't manage the air to scream as whatever it was pressed hard against her ribs and crushed her lungs. At first, she thought it was a wild animal, a wolf, no matter Dr. Rangel's aspersions against them possibly existing in the Highlands, but then an arm, wiry and strong, curled about her front and grasped her by the chin, jerking her head back. Sonia struggled, kicking and thrashing, her hands coming up to claw at a thick, masculine wrist, and she finally did scream when a pain like no other drove itself into her neck. It hurt. It hurt so terribly, Sonia would have wailed if she could have, at the fiery sensation searing like a knife into her neck and throat and chest. Nails bit into the skin of her face, bony fingers flexing, and as suddenly as it had begun, it ended, and Sonia was thrown to the ground. She laid in the mud, gasping, and her hand scrambled at her neck. She couldn't see it, but she could feel the warm, wet pulse of blood gushing under her fingertips. The burning sensation continued, seeming to spread through Sonia's veins and ache behind her eyes. Something bit me, she realized, struck dumb by the notion. Someone dash. A man stood over her like an obelisk, dressed in a long black cloak the rain slid off of, the edge of his face and the glint of his cloak's fastenings illuminated by the torch still clasped in Sonia's shaking hand. The gold curls of his hair were plastered to his head, dripping with water. He looked at her once with bored, formless pity, like a person who'd seen a bird with a broken wing on the pavement and kept walking without further thought. The man glanced away and stepped over Sonia, ignoring her feeble efforts to stop him. In his gloved hand, he held the fanged skull. The others, he asked, and Sonia saw more people there, more shrouded figures looming out of the murk, their silhouettes somehow darker than the miserable night around them. Who are they? Where did they come from? Who? Finished, answered a taller man in an accent Sonia didn't recognize in her panicked state. Good, said the first. Order your men to clear the site and repair the breach in the ward before first light. I'll make certain the humans disappear without comment. And the locals, sire? Won't they ask questions? They're superstitious enough to keep their mouths shut. Another shouted from a distance. Should we alert the Albions? And the first answered with a laconic drawl, why bother, as he raised the skull toward his eye level. Poor Radu. They should have left you in the dirt to shrivel up into dust. Sonia, at this point, had managed to rise to her knees, and she fully intended to run as fast as she could from these strangers to find help. Blood pushed against the fingers she had pressed to her neck, and Sonia swallowed her panting, fearful breaths, terrified she was going to find her end on this rural hillside among the grey stones and windswept grass. She didn't want to die. She needed to get help. Sonia took one step and the ground crumbled beneath her boot, the crevasse opening wide, the fissures rising and rippling like a swelling sea. The earth swallowed Sonia whole, and she fell into the dark. The steady drip of water against her cheek stirred Sonia into awareness. Her eyelids flickered and fluttered, her mouth moving with soundless words as her nightmares lost form and her hand dragged against the ground. It was the feeling of loose grit under her fingers that jarred Sonia into opening her eyes, and she scrunched her nose and groaned from the stiffness in her limbs as she looked around. The water kept trickling, the noise echoing behind her. Sonia rolled to her back and flinched against the feel of cold stone, her mind trying to make sense of what had happened. She remembered the rain, and she remembered the night. The heaviness of the fog wreathed around the mountain, the dark soaking into the world like hot, blinding tar. She remembered someone else, someone not supposed to be there, someone who someone who bit her. Shrieking, Sonia sat up and fumbled at the neck of her windbreaker. To her horror, her fingertips traced the definite, tender impressions of teeth marks. Obviously, she couldn't see the wound, but her front was damp and rust-colored from the blood. Good God, she muttered, anxious gaze flitting upward, taking in the dark, rough shapes of fallen boulders and shale. She stumbled to her feet. That man had bit her. Bit her like a dash. No, I won't buy into their sick game. Everyone's lost their bloody minds. Above her, Sonia thought she detected moonlight, or what could pass for moonlight on such a dreary, waterlogged night. She could see a lighter stripe in the craggy, highlighted outline of rocks, the crevasse, open like a slim maw leading into the mouth of a toothy, horrifying sea creature. It must have been 40 feet above her. I couldn't have survived a fall like that. It's impossible. Yet, there Sonia stood, sore and bloodied and roughed up, but most definitely breathing with her limbs intact. She touched her neck again, wanting to cover the wound, and inspected the crevasse's bottom. She and the others had theorized the storm had weathered away the upper crust of a cave system, and the tree's fall had broken the stone enough to reveal it to the light of day. Gazing at it now, Sonia knew she was not in a cave, at least not one that had remained untouched by mankind. She picked up her torch, the glass lens cracked but still intact, and shone it on towering grey walls comprised of brick and mortar, vast beams of dark wood arching under a high ceiling of rotting planks and packed earth. A hall stretched before her far beyond the scope of her light or the watery moonlight above. Sonia marveled at the austerity, the lack of intricacy or personal touches relieving the stretches of solid brick. There was nothing but dirt on the stone floor from the cave-in, no insect-eaten rugs or busted benches or old pottery. There were no carvings on the beams or artistry in the walls. It was all very utilitarian in Sonia's opinion. It served a function and that was it, though she didn't have an idea what function that could be. Sonia glanced again at the crevasse above and pursed her lips. What was she meant to do? Stay in place and wait for rescue? Had everything she remembered been a delusion? A kind of dream created from a hard bump to her head? She'd heard stranger stories before, and so didn't discount the possibility out of hand. Her fingers brushed her neck again. The wound there was real enough, and Sonia decided if anything she recalled from above had happened, she needed to find help. If it turned out to be nothing more than a fevered, concussed dream, she could have a good laugh with her friends when she was found. That left the dark, silent hall as the only means of possible escape. Swallowing, Sonia pointed her torch into the shadows and mustered her courage. There had to be an entrance somewhere, though whether it was accessible remained to be seen. She started walking, ignoring the frightened thumping of her heart and the ache in her neck, letting the torch rove over her surroundings in search of the exit. The first hall gave way to a second, and then a third, and Sonia gaped at the sheer size of the ruin. How had it gone undiscovered? Who had built this? The farther she moved from the crevasse, the more uneasy Sonia became. She had only the torch in her hand, and it flickered every so often, battered as it was from the fall, and when it finally went out, Sonia would be lost in the dark. The next barren hall she stepped into branched into different passages and the torch died in her hand. Damn it, Sonia cursed, smacking the metal casing, rattling the batteries. Though the torch flickered once or twice, the light didn't come back. Damn you! Her cry echoed and seemed to mock her. Sonia panted in fear and turned in place, meaning to return the way she'd come, but the dark disoriented her, and she froze, gasping. My phone. She knew she wouldn't have reception so deep in the earth, but Sonia did have a light app, and she quickly turned it on after abandoning the dead torch. Her phone had a sizable crack in the screen as well, but that didn't impede the light from shining, and she wanted to burst into tears from sheer relief. Sonia turned again. The passages all looked the same, meaning she couldn't remember the right way. Brilliant, Sonia. Simply brilliant. Hand to her sweaty brow, she closed her eyes and tried to think. This way. Sonia squeaked. She almost dropped her phone, convinced she'd heard someone call out to her, but no voice lingered in the hall, no sound aside from her own heavy breathing. What in the world? Hello, she said, uncertain, and the word fell flat in the still air. The voice returned, weaker now, and it seemed to play against her cheek like a finger drawn under her jaw, tapping her chin. This way, this way. Sonia let the voice draw her toward a passage on the right with a long, narrow corridor beyond it, and she paused at a wooden door, ancient and withered despite the lack of elements. The voice had to be the wind that, or madness was catching. Sonia hoped it to be the former option and that her ears, no matter the tricks they played, were leading her toward the exit. It's the wind, she murmured to herself, searching for a way to open the door. And where there's wind, there's a way out. She found the lock-A latch driven into the stone somewhat higher than she would expect for a normal door and pushed the barrier inward. The doweled hinges crackled, and Sonia had to throw the whole of her weight into the shove to get the door open enough to pass through. It slammed shut behind her, and she had the terrible premonition of it sealing closed like the lid of a suffocating tomb. I have to get a hold of myself. This way, this way. Well, if you are a ghost, you're very pushy, Sonia muttered, using her phone to illuminate the new room. It was massive, a huge, gaping chamber with a ceiling too high for her eyes to reach, the whole of it encircled in several levels of unembellished mezzanines with dozens upon dozens of arches leading into countless rooms. The architecture was clearly Viking in design, early Scandinavian, if she had to guess, time to those first invasions well over 1,000 years ago, but nothing in Sonia's studies compared to the structure of this place. What on earth had they used it for? Sonia walked, and again came the persistent touch of fingers against her cheek. This time she stopped because the feeling felt too real, and it sent shivers skittering down her spine. That pleasant, warm sensation had to be the wind, had to be air moving somewhere on ahead, but Sonia couldn't shake her fears. She paused, and the soft, muffled sound of footsteps continued without her. Dread turned her stomach. Something was following her, and instinct drove Sonia to stop herself before calling out. If it had been someone from the expedition, they would have made themselves known. They would have shouted her name or for help, and they wouldn't be moving so steadily, so confidently. It was not one of her friends. She broke into a light jog and then a faster run, desperate to put space between herself and whatever trailed her in the dark. At length, Sonia came to a set of stairs and wanted to cry, as the stairs led deeper into the unknown instead of upwards toward the surface. She nevertheless took them because going back would mean confronting whatever had wandered in behind her, and Sonia did not want to meet it. She didn't know why. The rational side of her brain shrieked that she was a daft cow and it was most likely her bloody rescue attempting to find her, but a seemingly more intrinsic part of her seized control and forced Sonia forward, memories of pain and blood gushing under her hand acting like a stick at her back. This way. Something tugged on her wrist, a hand on her own, pulling her to the side once she reached the last step. Sonia took a long, stuffy tunnel, barely able to see a thing even with her phone held out before her. There was yet another room at the tunnel's end, and Sonia cursed her own luck when she noted the lack of available exits. At first glance, the room looked much like the others, comprised of thick, molded stones and heavy cross rafters. The blandness was why Sonia could not help but stare at the single carving on the wall. It was above an iron door, an oddity in and of itself, considering the size and material rendered it too heavy to be usable, the top welded to a chain pulley system with ancient gears attached above and to the bronze pulley stationed by the door. It didn't match the date of the architecture despite its ancient patina. As far as Sonia understood, the technology and physics displayed here were beyond the Vikings' time. The anachronism set her teeth on edge. Brow furrowed, Sonia approached the door, her eyes fixed on the carving chiseled into the rock as she nervously pondered its significance. She recognized it as a symbol denoting the web of WIRD, 9 intersecting lines coming together in the form of a net. 9 was a powerful number for the Vikings, a good omen, some would say, and the web of WIRD was meant to contain all iterations of runes inside of itself. A kind of pot wherein all possibilities swirled. Historians and anthropologists had come to associate the web of WIRD with the Viking insistence of fate, both the promise and the doom of it. It could be found with records of births and with records of deaths. Fate presented hope for something more, but as Sonia had learned through her years studying folk customs and legends, destiny could be a double-edged sword. There was hope for some and penitence for others, a reminder that fate was inescapable, for good or ill. As someone trapped underground with something following her, Sonia did not appreciate the message of inevitable doom. Tap, tap, tap. Startled, Sonia stepped back. The sound came again, an impatient rapping against the metal barrier separating her from whatever made the noise. Tap, tap, tap. Open it, the voice crooned in Sonia's ear. That was most definitely not the wind, and Sonia decided she had no desire to find out what the ancient Vikings decided to seal behind that door and leave to its wretched fate. It could stay there for all she cared. Now that's just rude. Sonia stopped. The phone shook in her hand. Open it, the voice said, sterner now, louder, so much so Sonia realized she could actually hear it resonating from behind the barrier. Footsteps clattered in the long tunnel, and she choked, looking for somewhere to hide. "They're coming for you." "They?" Sonia stuttered. The voice agreed. "Not long now." A flash of pain went through her, the phantom lash of rain and sharp, sharp teeth. "Open it, and I'll protect you. I promise." Invisible fingers curled around Sonia's and blindly turned them to the bronze lever. "Open it. Please." Beyond the hysterical thought of my hand is moving on its own, holy shite, Sonia reasoned the force had to be all in her head, else it wouldn't need her at all. If a ghost or whatever this was could move a person like a puppet on strings, then it could pull a blasted lever on its own. Indeed, the sensation fell flat the moment she realized this, and she swore she heard an impatient sigh. The footsteps came closer. Sonia shut her eyes and yanked on the lever. She didn't know why she did it. Releasing whatever waited inside should have been terrifying, but the steps in the tunnel and the memory of the golden-haired man frightened Sonia more. She pulled the lever and thought the door would rise like a portcullis, but instead, the chains lurched, and the gears whirled, clattering like thunder. Sonia yelped when the barrier came crashing down like a drawbridge, her phone slipping from her grasp, covering the light. Dust exploded into the air from the disturbance, burning her eyes, and Sonia barely had time to blink before the figure was upon her. She stumbled. Slim, warm fingers brushed against the line of her jaw and tucked into her hair, pulling her head back, and hot breath pooled over her shoulder. The figure inhaled and froze, an unseen mouth hovering over the open wound on Sonia's neck. "Oh," a male voice remarked, surprised. "Oh, well, that won't do at all." And then he was gone, Sonia falling to her backside with a grunt. Someone shouted in the tunnel, snarling, and Sonia covered her ears against the sudden shriek and clattering of metal. Her pulse thrummed heavy under her palms, roaring like a river, and her neck burned. Then, the snarling and banging and foreign cursing stopped. The footsteps returned, but softer now, moving quickly. Sonia scrambled back to her feet and snatched up her phone, nearly tripping over the fallen iron barrier in her haste. Whoever had been pursuing her in the tunnel had stopped moving, everything quiet once more, but that left Sonia alone with the thing she'd released. Gulping, Sonia's shaking hand lifted the phone and directed the light toward the tunnel's entrance. A man stood there, waiting, and when the light found him, he smiled. "Hello."